Resistance Management School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by CropLife Canada.
We're joined now by Frank Dion, Colorado State University, and we're going to talk resistance management. We're here in London at the Certified Crop Advisor annual meeting. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Bernard. I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. Hey, we've talked a lot about resistance management on the Resistance Management School. One thing we haven't done was talk about a herbicide risk management, risk assessment. And you've got 6 great points that I think growers really should be thinking about. Let's run through those, Frank. First one you had was, ask yourself as a grower, have you been using the same herbicide or herbicides with the same mode of action?
Yes, and this is a key factor in managing resistance and assessing whether your management practices are conducive to the selection of resistance. And that's for a very simple fact. Evolution is an evolutionary process. And as with everything else in life, organisms adapt to their environment. When we apply a herbicide or a class of herbicide with the same mode of action, we are imparting a selection pressure on a group of plants, which we'll call individual plants. And in a field, if you imagine that you have 100,000 weeds, they all receive the same amount of herbicide, and they will be challenged by this. And hopefully the herbicide will work and kill the plants. Once in a while, plants will have mutations that are naturally occurring that provide resistance. So one individual may survive that treatment. Now, that is not a problem if the next year you apply a herbicide that affects a different target site. But if you apply a herbicide or a group of herbicides that have the same target site, then that one individual that survived the previous year will have generated offsprings that will survive as well. And over time, you'll end up with a patch of resistance. And depending how rapidly through pollen and seed dissemination, how quickly those things can move. Like in Colorado, we have a plant called the kochia, for example. That's a tumbleweed. One single plant will make 100,000 seeds. And over the winter, as it tumbles across the field, you could have resistant individuals disseminated over a mile. Now, some other plants don't spread as fast. Hopefully, you can catch resistance earlier than that. But making sure that you rotate mode of action as you do your field treatment will ensure that you slow down the possibility of evolution.
Another point you made, for growers was, ask yourself, has your uncontrolled weed been previously controlled by that same herbicide in the previous years?
Right, and I should also remind listeners that what I'm talking about here is risk assessment done by a farmer on his own field. Just common sense observation of what works normally, and then if you have used particular weed management methods that worked before, and all of a sudden you have plants that start escaping the treatment, that is a red flag. It doesn't mean you have resistance, but it is something that you need to keep in mind to maybe investigate further.
Another point you added was, are there live weeds beside dead weeds?
Yeah, that's a good telltale factor to look at in your field. As you scout for your weeds, and after your treatment, a very good telltale sign that you may have resistant weeds would be that if you have the same weed species in a patch, and you will have living organisms next to burned down or dead individuals, that suggests that you may have resistant individuals because you apply the herbicide effectively, you get the control that you expect, except you have a few individuals that survive. That is a red flag.
Yeah. Another point you mentioned was, has your general weed control declined? Is it losing effectiveness?
Yes, and that brings into another factor. So the previous one, when you have live individuals and dead individuals of the same species, that suggests that you have selected possibly for resistance in that field. When you have a particular weed management protocol that worked in the past, but then slowly stops working, that may be evidences of what's called weed shifts, that you actually have weeds that are naturally more tolerant. So it's not really necessarily resistance, but that you are selecting for weeds that have more natural tolerance of your herbicide, which is just as much of a problem. And so that tends to be a slow process. So we call that creeping resistance, which is really tolerance. That's over several years, maybe the population of your weeds change in your field, and all of a sudden you end up concentrating with weeds that are more difficult to control.
You also asked that growers keep an eye out, in nearby fields, ditches, for weeds that are not controlled, possibly resistance.
Yes. The best management practice to avoid resistance is not to have resistance and manage it, but to prevent the establishment of your resistance in your field. So if you know from going to regional meetings or talking to your crop advisors or crop consultants, if they know that resistance exists in neighbor fields or in the next county, or if you have issues with your ditches or around your farm, well, you better catch it there rather than after it gets into your field. So being aware of not only how effective your management is in your field, but as well as what's around it. Being more broad in how you consider weed management will be to your advantage.
And especially if those species are being controlled elsewhere, right?
Yes.